What we're doing this semester, for those of you who are just joining us, we looked the last couple of weeks at Narnia. We read the Chronicles of Narnia. You're supposed to read the Chronicles of Narnia, at least The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we discussed that and did an overview of each one of the Chronicles. Tonight, we are going to begin looking at what is my very favorite of all of C.S. Lewis's writings, which is the Space Trilogy, as it's often called. But really, it's not properly the Space Trilogy, because only two of them really take place in space, Mars and Venus. The third, That Hideous Strength, as you may know, takes place on Earth. And so it's better to think of the Space Trilogy as the Ransom Trilogy. Now, some Lewisians will get really snotty if you call it the Space Trilogy, and so it's better for you, if you're going to be accepted into the inner ring, as Lewis says, to refer to it as the Ransom series or the Ransom Trilogy, because all three of the stories revolve around Elwin Ransom. Now, do you remember me telling you who Elwin Ransom is patterned after? Tolkien. And how do we know that? What is it about Ransom that's similar to Tolkien? He's a philologist, and then Tolkien was a philologist. It means he was a professor of languages. He was a scholar of languages. In fact, as we discussed last semester, the entirety of Middle-earth was not kind of an end in and of itself. Middle-earth, for Tolkien, was created as an arena for the languages, an entire system of languages, alphabet, grammar, syntax that Tolkien had created, and he needed a place for the language to be spoken. And of course, the rest is history, particularly the history of Middle-earth. And so all of the characters of Lord of the Rings and all of the stories and all of the drama around Lord of the Rings is an arena in which the languages can be on display. Well, Elwin Ransom in the Ransom Trilogy is patterned after Tolkien, and so we're going to jump in here. Now, what would bring Lewis to write? And just so you know, these are like my working copies, and That Hideous Strength is elsewhere. But I also, when I really love a book, I'll get multiple editions. I'll collect editions of it, and so you can even get these beautiful hardbound editions of that. Of the Ransom series. Ken has all of it over here, the paperbacks and everything. But how many of you've read the Ransom series? All three of? Okay, wow. All right. So your favorite? So is it John? Is that right, John? What is your favorite of the Ransom series?
As good as the other two are, The Hideous Strength is so pertinent.
So pertinent. Yeah, so pertinent. We'll unpack that tonight. I'll come back to you. I want to know why you think it's pertinent. Yeah. Perelandra.
I just think we know so little about the details of Eden, and and I haven't read Screwtape, so but I get I get some Screwtape in Perelandra, and we go deep on Eve, we go deep on the Tempter, and I just think it's incredibly interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And Perelandra, here's the thing about Perelandra. For Lewis, Perelandra was one of the books that he thought best represented his abilities as a writer. Now, what, was sort of befuddling to him was that, he was made famous in America primarily because of Screwtape and then Narnia. And Screwtape is not, he would admit, Screwtape is not the pinnacle of his literary efforts. It's not intended to be. It's a dialogue between Wormwood and Screwtape and a series of letters, and yet that's what kind of broke him into the American scene. But for him, Perelandra, and if you've read Perelandra, from a literary standpoint, it's breathtaking. Of the three, it's probably, from a literary standpoint, the most enthralling. But yeah, so we'll talk a bit about Perelandra and Eden. Other thoughts? Which is your favorite?
First two.
The first.
The third one was over my pay grade.
Okay. Okay.
I don't have enough knowledge of history and philosophy and all that.
Yeah.
I'm a math chem person.
Yeah.
And I'm simple, but the first two are fun.
Yeah, you're simple. That's what most people say. Yeah. That, untruer things never spoken. Other thoughts of the three, your favorite, if you have one.
It struck me in Perelandra how beautifully and how eloquently and how particularly Lewis can describe how indescribable a thing is.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And one of the things we'll discover tonight is that some of the critics of Lewis, when the book came out, Lewis early on wanted to be a poet. Remember, we talked about that last semester. He wanted to be a poet, and his poetry was never really well received. It wasn't reviewed well. So Lewis is known for his prose styling, and yet Perelandra, one of the criticisms of Perelandra, and it was actually a compliment in the form of criticism, was that it was so beautiful and detailed and bordering on the absurd of trying to describe the indescribable and painting these pictures that were almost ineffable, almost unspeakable. That here's an example of where Lewis probably should have done it as poetry, because his prose was so incredible, and just the picturesque nature of what he's saying in Perelandra was so incredible that prose almost is not really the proper vehicle for what he's doing in Perelandra. Poetry would have been a better vehicle for what he is describing in Perelandra. And so you're right, he's describing the indescribable. There are times at which you feel like Lewis is just bursting the bonds of anthropomorphic language to get his point across, to get the picture that he's trying to paint across.
Can I read an example?
Please do, please do.
So I read these as a kid.
Yeah.
My mother had read them, and I did not understand them. I'm going back and there's so much more fulsome understanding. I heard you say this about Perelandra last week, and so I'm reading Perelandra again right now. And I'm right, and it took me a day and a half to get through the first 3 chapters, because that first couple of chapters is just so pregnant with all
Right.
And so he's talking about his first time on Perelandra, and he's in the water coming out of the coffin, and so I just love this. He says,
I'm going to get the microphone for you here, if I can, so everybody can hear you.
he's floating around in this water that is moving him around in all these really amazing ways. He says, as he rushed smoothly up the great convex, this is in the first chapter, hillside of the next wave, he got a mouthful of water. It was hardly at all flavored with salt. It was drinkable like fresh water, and only by an infinitesimal degree less insipid. Though he had not been aware of thirst till now, his drink gave him a quite astonishing pleasure. It was almost like meeting pleasure itself for the first time. Like that, that description. He buried his flushed face in the green translucence, and when he withdrew it, he found himself once more on top of it. I stopped and was like, wow, that's a thought. Right?
I know.
And it's funny, because that's a lot of things we're talking about in terms of the attributes of God, how he is particular things. And now I'm seeing all that stuff pop out in these chapters. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and for you to think that this, kind of dowdy looking English Don, one time somebody said, they came up and asked, who this was in my shirt. So who do you think it is? And they said, is it you? I thought, wow. Okay. All right. Well,
You had a little more hair
I had a little more hair than that. Yeah. But to think that this dowdy Englishman who ground his cigarette and pipe, ashes into his carpet because that keeps the moths away, but he can wax so poetic, and Perelandra is where he does it. If you are an artist, if you're a songwriter, if you're a poet, Perelandra is going to be your cup of Earl Grey. It really is going to be your cup of tea, because it is so picturesque. And we'll look at a couple of places. We'll go a couple of places tonight. I think for me, even though I fully agree that hideous strength is probably the most pertinent, and I think he intended for it to be, and we'll unpack that here in a little bit. And Perelandra, there's just, again, when his critics say he, as skilled as he is at prose styling, what he's describing, prose almost can't carry the freight. It's so, only poetry can carry the freight of what he's trying to do here. And I fully agree. I think for me, Out of the Silent Planet, just because it first enthralled me for the whole series. And though it is simpler by far than that hideous strength, and it certainly does not have the literary weightiness of Perelandra. There was just something enthralling, the entry point and the intrigue and so forth. I mean, I don't know, I love them all. Lewis, of course, when he was a little boy, a couple of his favorite authors were H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. And in many ways, the Ransom series, and particularly Out of the Silent Planet, the first of the series, he is writing with H.G. Wells in mind, because one of the things that that he is wanting to do is to, as we're going to see, counter materialism, which he's doing all throughout the whole series. And it's really Out of the Silent Planet that he has in mind a way to answer the materialism, the atheistic materialism of H.G. Wells. The other thing that we really didn't touch on last semester was when Lewis was a little boy, he and his brother were given a telescope as a gift. And as a little boy, that set in motion, I mean, the planets were set in motion for Lewis, no pun intended. He says that, and this is in Surprised by Joy, a peculiar, heady attraction, which was quite different from any other of my literary interests. The interest, when the fit was on me, was ravenous, like a lust. My own planetary romances have been not so much the gratification of that fierce curiosity as its exorcism. And so what he's saying there is that as a little boy, I became so enraptured at the thought of cosmology, at the thought of, and what would later become for him, the sort of medieval scheme of planetary structure, which is, and why is that important for Narnia? What did we discover last week? That the Easter egg that's hidden in each one of the Narnian, I mean, do you remember last week what we discussed? In fact, let me go back there just for a second. So you remember last week, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the planet that is on, that takes main stage in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is Jupiter. And that phrase, by Jove, by Jupiter, by joy, this will be accomplished. Jupiter is the joyful planet, is the planet of happiness, of victory, of pleasure, of joy. And so you'll see by Jove as a phrase mentioned not only in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but throughout the Ransom series. And so that is not just an English colloquialism for Lewis. That is very intentional. It's an Easter egg that he's planting, because what he's wanting to say is that joy wins out. Joy wins the day. And so for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Jupiter; for Prince Caspian, Mars; Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and then the Sun, which was considered one of the planets in the medieval cosmology; Silverchair, the Moon; the Horse and His Boy, Mercury; Magician's Nephew, Venus; and The Last Battle, Saturn. But you see in the Ransom series the same thing. In other words, Lewis was already dealing with planetary themes, or having the characteristics that in the medieval mind was ascribed, the characteristics that were ascribed to the planets, as though the planets were like characters. He was already doing it in the Ransom series. Now, we said last week, and even last semester, and too much has been made of this, quite honestly, but that Tolkien was not as high on Narnia as Lewis was on Middle Earth. In fact, Tolkien admits, had it not been for the encouragement of Lewis, Lord of the Rings never would have seen the light of day. And as we said before, there are so many volumes of Tolkien's work. I mean, you can go back there and see so many volumes of Tolkien's work, and yet the vast majority of that is because his son Christopher took over his papers and his files after his father died and edited them and shaped them into publishable form. Tolkien was just a maniacal perfectionist, and he never would have gotten all of this published in his lifetime. But even The Lord of the Rings would not have seen the light of day had it not been for Jack's constant encouragement. And yet, Tolkien was not so high on Narnia. Now, it wasn't that he hated Narnia. He kept copies of Narnia at the house for his grandchildren to read. He just thought that there were some things that were out of place. Why does Santa Claus, for instance, show up in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It seemed, as Michael Ward says, rather slapdash, which is such an English way of saying it, rather slapdash, and it didn't seem as meticulous as Tolkien would have had it. And if you've ever read at kind of the same week, maybe you're reading Narnia and you're reading The Lord of the Rings, there is a level of detail that is in The Lord of the Rings that is not in Narnia. Well, Narnia, of course, is for children primarily, but the same could be said, you compare The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. There's definitely a difference of level of detail and so forth, and literary styling between them. And yet, that Tolkien missed that sort of cohering reality in Narnia of this planetary scheme, and the fact that the reason that this was published, in part, was because of Tolkien's influence. And so Tolkien knew and approved of the planetary series, or the Ransom series, and yet the fact that for instance, in the Ransom series, you have Mars as Melicandra. Okay, you have Paralandra is Venus, and so Lewis is already doing this. You would think Tolkien would have been aware. This is the way he rolls, but he missed it entirely and never saw. And frankly, no one ever saw it until Michael Ward did in Planet Narnia here in the 2000s. And so that Easter egg stayed hidden in Narnia all these years. Lewis took it to his grave, and yet this love for planetary theme is embedded in Lewis all the way back in his childhood. And as he said, it was ravenous, like a lust. And the fact that he embedded it in the Ransom series and in Narnia, it wasn't so much simply him, gratifying an interest. It was like an exorcism. He had to get it out of his system. And so you see that as a sort of substructure or a Grundlage in both Ransom and in Narnia. Now, one of the things that influenced Lewis when he was very young was David Lindsay's Voyage to Arcturus, 1920. And this was not a great literary achievement, but what Lewis discovered there was this idea of an adventurer traveling to other planets. And so he's got his telescope, he's reading Jules Verne, he's reading H.G. Wells, now he is reading Lindsay, and this is sort of stoking that fire for him of possible other environments, possible other experiences. And if you consider the fact that he can look at Warnie's biscuit tin that has a little moss garden in it, and what opens up embryonically in little Jack's mind is what would later become Narnia. He has a bent for adventure, a bent for traveling in a literary standpoint, in terms of ideas and thinking about joy in the way that it takes you out beyond your current circumstance. But perhaps one of the most influential writers for Lewis was not simply that he was responding to the materialism of H.G. Wells and the atheism of H.G. Wells, but a man named J.B.S. Haldane. J.B.S. Haldane was an atheist, materialist, Marxist socialist, and his book, 1927, Possible Worlds, was something that had a real impact on Lewis, and in many ways, he is reacting not only to H.G. Wells or writing responsively to H.G. Wells, but also to Haldane. And that's in part what makes That Hideous Strength so pertinent. And we'll talk about that a little bit here. And some of what I'm going to say is kind of going to let the cat out of the bag when it comes to That Hideous Strength. So we'll just kind of let them all three sort of mix and match together. We won't be so worried about moving from one to the other the way we did with Narnia, because some of what Lewis is doing here is, in my opinion, and this is probably too simplistic, but in my opinion, I think you could probably say that the modernist project, and particularly strict kind of materialist atheism, is put on warning in Out of the Silent Planet. I think when it comes to Paralandra and the way that the unman, Weston, whom we meet here, winds up in Paralandra with Ransom, and they meet the Eve figure, the unfallen Eve of Venus, and the unman, or Weston, takes on the form of the serpent in the garden and starts tempting Eve, the Eve of Paralandra. And in tempting her, the way that he goes about it is in much the same way that the serpent does in the Garden of Eden. And he starts gaslighting her and really taking a postmodern track toward language and the meaning of words and the possibility of truth. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so again, this is simplistic, but I think modernism is served notice here. Postmodernism is put on notice here, and metamodernism is put on notice here. Now, Lewis was not thinking about metamodernism. In fact, we don't really hear people talking about metamodernism until around 2010, when a couple of Dutch scholars wrote an article on metamodernism. Their last names were Vermeulen and van der Alken, and they talked about metamodernism. And when you think of the modernist project, you think of modernism. Modernism as an ism, and this is 30,000 feet, modernism as an ism believed that there was absolute truth. There is absolute truth. Now, they disagreed on what that truth was, different thinkers. They disagreed on how you would get to that truth. For instance, is it René Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am? Is our foundation for knowing reality, is it rational? Or John Locke, is it empirical? We know by our senses, and our five senses are the foundation for our epistemology, or how we know what we know. Is it, as Immanuel Kant would say, sort of an impersonal, transcendental idealism? Whatever your approach to knowledge, whatever your approach to how you know what you know, there is something to be known, and there are true things that can be said about it, and in fact, there would be a controlling motif. Now again, David Hume, the great Scottish atheistic philosopher, believed that there was reality and truth that could be known, and yet it was known materialistically, it was known empirically. Locke would agree. Descartes, who was a Christian, nonetheless believed, sort of a Thomistic fashion, that we can know truth rationally, and yet truth is there to be known. The modernists agreed that there is a controlling narrative, a controlling worldview. They disagreed on what it was and how you would get to it and how you would understand it, but truth is there, and they fought over what truth was, if I can say it that way. Now, one of the things that the Modernist Project gave us, and this is what you see Lewis starting to take aim at in Out of the Silent Planet, is this idea that man as an evolving creature is advancing. He's advancing technologically. He's advancing in terms of rationality and scientism, not science, but scientism, where scientism becomes essentially a foundation for knowing, and it virtually becomes deified itself. But man is moving forward. Man no longer needs the straitjacket of Christianity. We've talked a little bit about Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, who said, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. And would say that truth is actually just a mobile army of metaphors, basically coins that have lost their image. Truth has no meaning. Words have no meaning. And so in some ways, Nietzsche was sort of the great fulcrum point from modernism to postmodernism, prophesied postmodernism, but functioned also very clearly as a materialist modernist himself. And I think that's just because he was prophetic and brilliant, hated Christianity, hated Jesus Christ, hated Christians, particularly hated Jesus Christ because of the Sermon on the Mount. And because the Sermon on the Mount calls us to weakness, it calls us to other-centeredness. And for Nietzsche, that was utterly repulsive. And so for Nietzsche, the only way that we were ever going to rise beyond this sort of stunted plateau that we had hit in the evolutionary process was if we would will ourselves to power and become the Ubermensch, or the overman, the superman. And we had to will ourselves to power. He was an existential nihilist, We start at nothing, we end at nothing, everything in between is nothing. And so what you got to do in the meantime is will yourself to power, because your power and you determining your own meaning is the only meaning there is. There is nothing outside of you transcendentally that will give you meaning or purpose. There's much more we could say about Nietzsche. But during this time, the thing that starts to win out is not the Christianity of a Descartes, or even the Lutheranism of Immanuel Kant, although Immanuel Kant, with his transcendental idealism, nonetheless made knowledge of God utterly something we could not know, because he moved it into what was called the noumenal realm. And skepticism arises. He's trying to ward off the inevitable skepticism that David Hume would bring, and basically admit, yes, scientism is winning the day. That's true knowledge. That's hard knowledge. But we've at least got to subjectively have faith, or we have no basis for ethics. But what Kant ends up doing in that move is he just solidifies any escape from pure skepticism when it comes to matters of faith. And so all this is kind of, in the wash in the 17 and 1800s with the rise of Darwinian naturalism and atheism. It really takes over in Europe. But the modernist is thinking, okay, we've gotten rid of the straitjacket of Christianity, which is what Nietzsche wanted. Christianity is a straitjacket. It's going to keep you stunted, superstitious, believing in all of these miraculous things and dying and rising gods. You've got to grow beyond that. And of course, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for Nietzsche, he's saying to Europe, you've killed God, you've outgrown God, you're the murderers of God, but you're too afraid to own it. So you need to put on your big boy pants and just acknowledge that you have outgrown God and you've killed him and you've gotten rid of Christianity. Now live up to it. Rise up to what you've done. You've killed God, you've gotten rid of Christianity, now be brave enough to own it. Well, all of this portends great kind of enthusiasm for man as an evolving, developing creature, no longer straitjacketed by religion, no longer straitjacketed by superstition, technological advance, industrial advance, all these kind of things. But all of that optimism is torpedoed with the First World War, the Great War. Because what you have in the Great War, kind of at the macro level, is kind of Napoleonic era fighting techniques, kind of hand-to-hand, rustic, undeveloped fighting techniques, while at the same time, great technological advance in the machinery of war. And so with the First World War, the combination of an outdated fighting technique with the advancement of all of this technology and machinery of war just led to millions upon millions of lives lost. And of course, that torpedoed the optimism in the modernist project. In other words, man is evolving, man has evolved, scientism is on the rise, and yet what happens? Rather than becoming more human, man becomes less human, and there is bloodshed, and there is basically just the war they thought would be the end of the world. It was the great apocalypse, the First World War. And then, just over 20 years later, you have the machinations and the beginnings of what would, by 39, be the Second World War. And by the Second World War, any remaining optimism in the modernist project, any remaining kind of enthusiasm about man, the modern maker of his own destiny, man, the advancing intellectual, man, the technological creature, was utterly decimated by the Second World War. So what happens with the collapse of the modernist project is the rise of postmodernism. Now, some of y'all have heard me talk about before Jean-Francois Lyotard. Is that a familiar name? I mentioned him in here before. Jean-Francois Lyotard, of course, you can guess he wasn't from Tater Peeler Road where I am. Jean-Francois Lyotard was a Frenchman. And the only thing French in Lebanon when I grew up were French fries. Although I took French many years ago for my doctorate, and my French tutor was this French lady. And I tried to kind of, as an icebreaker, when she walked in, and she was very French. Everything, you could just see her from a mile away. And remember, Diane, everything about her it just seemed so French. And so I tried to make a little joke and an icebreaker, and I said, she said, "Do you know any French?" And I said, well, you could look at me and tell I've eaten a lot of French fries. And she said, these are not French. These are Belgium. So now you know. If you learn anything tonight, you know that French fries are from Belgium, not from France. But my first French lesson, these are not French, these are Belgium. So anyway, Jean-Francois Lyotard wrote a book in 76, 77, La Condition Postmoderne Report La Savoir, which is the postmodern condition or report on knowledge. It was originally entitled La Condition Postmoderne Report aux Enfants, a postmodern condition for babies, kind of like gardening for dummies. And it was a simple explanation of postmodernism. And what Lyotard says is that after World War II, which was that final torpedo into the optimism of the modernist project, with World War II, there came a skepticism, or what he called post-World War II skepticism, of what he called the Le Grand Récit, the grand narrative, the grand story, the one worldview that makes sense of everything, whether it was a materialist worldview, whether it was a Christian worldview, whether it was some kind of Kantian idealist worldview. There's no one grand sense-making story or narrative that gets us at truth. There are only la petite récit, little stories or little narratives. And so each table here, say, is a community or a tribe, and each one of you uses language the way you use language, and you have different rules around language, different rules around ethics, different rules around reality and what constitutes truth. There's actually no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as true truth. Again, that's the incredulity of the meta-narrative. There's no meta-truth. There's no ultimate truth. There are only little micro-truths. Of course, if I say there's no such thing as a meta-narrative, there are only micro-narratives, I've, of course, committed a meta-narrative. Now, that may sound trite on the surface, but sometimes things that are trite are actually true. And so what happens? We go from, say, the middle of last century after the Second World War through the sexual revolution of the 60s and into some of the 70s, the self-indulgence of the 80s, and self-indulgent in the 80s probably reaches its pinnacle with big hair bands. You remember back in the late 80s when the pinnacle of music, the highest form of music ever in human history, of course, was hair metal. Can I get a witness? Maybe not. Or a couple of you, maybe I know you're with me, right? And so the pinnacle of music back in the day was, glam metal. It was hair metal.
I skipped that.
You skipped that. You're probably more of a...
60s to grunge.
60s to grunge. Okay, well, take grunge, for instance. Take grunge. Have you ever read the lyrics of Smells Like Teen Spirit? Load up on guns. I say, how's it go? Load up on guns. Something. It's fun to pretend. Here we are now. Entertain us. Here we are now. I'm contagious. An albino, a mosquito. An albino, a mosquito. My libido. Something. Anyway, you read the lyrics of Smells Like Teen Spirit, and you're like, oh, you have it. Okay, lay it on us here. In fact, if I hand you the microphone, Chris, would you sing it for us? So read the lyrics for us.
Sure. Load up on guns. Bring your friends. It's fun to lose and to pretend. She's overboard and self-assured. Oh no, I know a dirty word. Then hello, 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 hello. Richard.
Yeah.
When the light's out, it's less dangerous. Here we are now, entertain us. I feel stupid and contagious. Here we are now, entertain us. A mulatto, an albino, a mosquito, my libido. Yeah, hey,
Yeah.
hey, hey. I'm worse at what I do best, and for this guilt I feel blessed. Our little group has always been, and always will until the end. With the lights out, it's less dangerous. I think that's the same thing. It repeats.
Yeah.
And I forgot just why I taste. Oh yeah, I guess it makes me smile. I find it hard, it's hard to find. Oh well, whatever, never mind.
And then here we are now, entertain us. Yeah. So if you read those lyrics and you're like, I don't even know that I know what that song means, that's the point. That's the point. Grunge was the great demise of the pinnacle of self-indulgent, kind of hair metal by the end of the 80s. And hair metal bands were literally out of work because of grunge. So what ends up happening, you go through the self-indulgence of the 80s, and with the 90s, there is this sort of embracing of nihilism, this embracing of meaninglessness, this embracing of words have no meaning. What does art communicate? Art communicates there is no meaning. Of course, for art to communicate there is no meaning, that means there is no meaning, and so there's still meaning. You have to have meaning in order to say there is no meaning. It's because we live in a logocentric universe. You can't escape truth because we live in a personal, logocentric universe. John 1, Colossians 1, Hebrews 1. The logos is the agent of creation. And yet, with the collapse of the modernist project, the postmodernists come along and say there is no truth, there is no meaning, words have no meaning. You have philosophers like Jacques Derrida saying the same thing. There is no such thing as meaning. Words are simply citationality, and the only thing that exists, Derrida says, is context. The words I'm using right now do not have objective meaning. They only mean what I intend them to mean in this particular context. And the same words that I'm speaking right now could be spoken elsewhere, and they could be used differently and not mean what they mean right now. So there's only context, or what he calls citationality. Or Ludwig Wittgenstein was an earlier deconstructing, in terms of linguistics, philosopher who said, words have no meaning, there's just interpretation. So a word does not have objective meaning. It's just a matter of interpretation. Well, what's going on with postmodernism? They say all of you modernists who said there was truth out there, everything has come to nothing, and everything has just resulted in devastation and bloodshed. And they saw the bankruptcy of the modernist project, the bankruptcy of this idea of man evolving, going to the next phase of evolution, man moving himself forward at all costs. No matter what humanness was lost in the mix, it doesn't matter. Well, the postmodernist said to the modernist, your project has failed. And we question your commitment, Mr. Modernist, to reality, to truth being true, etc. And everything is just meaningless and everything is just purely pluralistic. Well, as the postmodern, if you hear someone say we live in a postmodern context, honestly, if somebody says that we are living in a postmodern context, quite frankly, 2000 called and wants its worldview back. We are no longer living in a postmodern context. We are living now in a metamodern construct. And what does that mean? Well, metamodernism, again, don't ever make the mistake of saying, we live in a postmodern culture. You do not. We do not. Your children and grandchildren are not living and trying to navigate a postmodern context. They are living in a metamodernist context. Now, what does that mean? Well, the metamodernists, long around say the mid-2000s, around 2010, started looking at, the postmodernists saw that the modernist project was bankrupt. And they raised the proper question. There is no dependable truth. And yet the metamodernist says, though they raised the right question, the postmodernists offered us no answer. And so all we have, ostensibly, is you have your truth, you have your truth, you have your truth. And the point of the postmodernists is to tolerate. You tolerate them, y'all tolerate them. We're tolerating one another's truth. But let me ask you today, when somebody says, what's true for me is true for me, what's true for you is true for you, truth is relative, we both agree, those days are over. What's true for me is true for me, and what's true for you is wrong.
Yes.
What's true for me is true for me. And so as a modernist, I believe there's truth. As a postmodernist, I believe I'm the center of it. But almost back to a modernist, if you disagree with me, you've violated an absolute. Does that make sense? So what's true for me is true for me, and what's true for you had better be the same thing that's true for me. Because if you disagree with me, you disdain me. If you disagree with me, you are an example of violence against me. And so in the metamodern construct in which we end, there's not a plurality of truths. Suddenly, what did the postmodern give us? the self, the rise of the self as the center of truth. And when the self becomes convinced that they are the center of truth, any self outside of that sphere, any self that disagrees, is going to have to be done away with. Now, why did I give you that sort of 30,000 feet flyover of modernism to postmodernism to metamodernism? Because in many ways, in my opinion, I think the kind of modernist belief in man must advance and evolve to the next stage begins here. Now, it continues here, but it's less evident here. Why? Because I think in some ways, modernism is on display here. Postmodernism is being challenged here as the unman, messes around with truth and words and gaslights Eve. But then what happens in that hideous strength? Though in Lewis's context, Lewis was a rabid anti-Marxist. He saw with his own eyes the rise of Marxism in Europe and the devastation that it caused. And in many ways, what's going on in that hideous strength is what began here with Weston saying, we will ravage the planets if we have to, as long as man can evolve to that next stage. Here, he kind of gets back to the creation thing and says, we need to rethink and go back to think what constitutes humanness. It's our createdness, and it's the story of the fall, and ultimately in Paralandra, the incarnation of Jesus as the solution. But then in that hideous strength, he comes back to Earth. This is not Mars, this is not Venus. That hideous strength is back on Earth, and as we'll see, an organization has formed, the purpose of which is to take man to the next evolutionary stage, no matter the cost. And anyone outside of this organization will be annihilated. Really fascinating. And yet, why would I say that portends metamodernism? Lewis couldn't have known about metamodernism. It's only something we've been talking about in the last 20 years or so. And yet, Lewis is always so relevant because he's quite prophetic. Because he had such a truly biblical and Trinitarian, I would say maybe more specifically an incarnational worldview. Right? This worldview, the lens through which he saw everything was the historically incarnate, dying and rising Christ. Well, because of that, what he probably was thinking more of in that hideous strength as answering the Marxist kind of evolutionary view of man is going to progress at all costs, and this kind of socialist thing that he's going after in that hideous strength actually has come back among us not as modernism, but as metamodernism. Now, Bill Edgar, who used to teach apologetics at Westminster, said that postmodernism is just most modernism. It's kind of just the next verse of the same song. Well, if postmodernism is most modernism, then metamodernism is most modernism. And so it comes back to the modernist belief that there is a controlling truth that everybody has to agree to and yield to, that controls everything. It's just it's not out there because a postmodernist told me it was in here. Oh, now that I'm convinced that I'm the center of truth, I've got news for the rest of you. There's an absolute truth and you're looking at him. And so what's going on then, even though Lewis never used the language of metamodernism, it wasn't around then, what you see in the organization called NICE, and I'll say more about it in a second, is an example of what that could look like at a societal level. Now, that was a mouthful. That was a lot. Any questions before we kind of jump in a little bit more to the influences? And you get that for free, okay? That was unscripted, but anyway.
It's beautiful.
But that's where we are. Y'all, that's what your grandchildren are going to, it's what your children are going to experience. You know, if you think about now, say Zillennials, my son he's a Gen Z. He's not a Zillennial, he's pure Gen Z. Pure Gen Z over there. I am pure Cro-Magnon, but anyway, I am Gen X. Okay, I am Gen X. Many of y'all are Gen X in here. Some of y'all are, Gen Y. Some of you, do it now. Boomers. You got boomers. Well, here's the thing, boomers, I told a group the other night this, we were talking about missionaries and how difficult it is now to get missionaries to go on the field. For every 4 boomer age pastors in America who are retiring from evangelical churches, there's only 1 to replace them. It's startling what's going on. But Gen Z, which my son and daughter and my daughter-in-law are just pure, unadulterated Gen Z, they are the ones who are going to be living with this. Gen Alpha, which are the kids who are in this school building every day in the high school, Gen Alpha, they're going to be living with this. And who knows what my kids' kids are going to be dealing with? Who knows what the little bitties now as they grow up? And so I think Lewis really helps us because what he does is he brings us back in the Ransom series. And his goal, he said he wanted to smuggle in theology. He's wanting to bring us back to humanness, true humanness. And what he realizes is that scientism has gotten it wrong. Atheistic Darwinianism has gotten it wrong when it comes to the question of anthropology. And Marxism has gotten it wrong when it comes to the question of society and ethics. Someone recently challenged my view of Marxism, and in the process of challenging that view of Marxism, they quoted C.S. Lewis as someone I should consider to take a softer view toward Marxism. I thought to myself, of everyone you could have quoted, that was the absolute number 1 wrong person to quote was C.S. Lewis. We might could have talked about maybe some liberation theologian or something back in the, the middle of last century, but Lewis wasn't one of them. Anyway,
David?
yeah.
Yeah, not sure if I get this question out right, but I understand what you're saying about the evolution, if you will, right, all the way up to metamodernism.
Yeah.
And my truth is the only truth, and your truth is wrong. And
Yeah.
Doesn't that exist throughout history in dictatorships or nationalism? Because if you're living in in that kind of, if you were living in Germany in the 1930s,
Yeah.
it was Hitler's truth, or so. Are we talking about the, I guess the literary people, the philosophers, etc., evolving to sort of understand what they've been? And one other thing, I kind of see, it's not nationalism, but I see this New World Order as being the same, except on a global scale.
Well, that's what this book is about. NICE, the corporation NICE, NICE, is the goal of NICE is to become a new world order and to remake man and take man to the next evolved, even to the point of man no longer needing a body. We can just be disconnected heads. If you can get enough blood and nutrients pumping toward the brain, we can even shed our need for the body, and the next sort of evolved status of man is not going to be hampered by the physical. And it's going to be a new world order. And Lewis saw this happening. Well, why did he see it happening? Well, because in Hitler's Germany, there was a scientist who actually dispatched a head from a human body and attempted to keep it alive. And so Lewis is saying this kind of thing is actually happening. And yeah, this is 1946. And so by 46, he's had plenty of time to reflect on the horrors of Nazi Germany. And, of course, he was in World War I. And so he saw the rise of Leninism. The thing that was sort of the common denominator across Europe with both Lenin and Hitler was that dictatorial erasure of individual dignity of the human person, the devolution of the human person in the name of evolution. You ever know that? When there is a materialist doctrine of evolution, humanity participates in devolution and becomes animalistic, and murder and degradation and impoverishment is on the rise. And so Lewis is able to see when these things are given power and are able to to take root, the results are quite devastating. And frankly, it was J.B.S. Haldane's Possible Worlds in 1927, wherein Haldane advocated for man is going to evolve into a collective superbrain, kind of a hive mind. And this was a science fiction novel, but Haldane, who was he was a physicist, he was a polymath scientist, brilliant, but was a radical materialist, atheistic Marxist. And so he hated Christianity. Haldane hated Christianity. And the thing that for him, the reason that he hated Christianity was because he believed very firmly that God's ways are not our ways. Now that comes, of course, from Isaiah 55. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways that your ways. For as high as heavens are above the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts and your thoughts. And what Haldane was saying is that's the problem. God's ways are restricting us ethically. God's ways are restricting us ethically, and we've got to throw that off, and we must become the maker of our own way. Now, out of the Silent Planet, which is the first of the Ransom series, Lewis is going after what, as I said earlier, might be called scientism. He's not going after science. He's not going after science. He's going after scientism. Adding ism to a word can have drastic results. You know that. And so he's going after scientism, the idea that the pinnacle of morality and meaning and purpose is discovered as man in this sort of survival of the fittest quest moves beyond this limited place we're in, cleans out the gene pool, and rises to higher and higher expressions of humanity, which is what takes us, the great quotation in here, and that hideous strength is the last aspect of nature that man will overcome is human nature. And then the battle will have been won. The only question that will remain will be who won the battle. Think about that, as only Lewis can say it. The last aspect of nature that man will overcome is human nature. Then the battle is over. The question is, who will have won the battle? And so Lewis is on a trajectory with all three of these volumes. And he's going after atheism, scientism, Marxism, anything that is to the degradation of the image of God in man. And the solution in all of it is to rediscover our purpose in Eden, and the only solution for that is, as we're going to discover in Perelandra here in just a minute, ultimately the incarnation, the incarnate one. Only the incarnate one in Perelandra can overthrow the unman, who is Weston in this book. Weston becomes possessed by the devil in this book, and Lewis calls him the unman. He has ceased to be human. And he becomes the tempter of Eve in Perelandra. And the only solution is for just as Aslan is the supposal of Christ or the appearance of Christ in Narnia, there's a character who becomes the supposal of Christ in Perelandra, and only by the incarnation can that problem be solved. Anyway, Lewis is wanting to create a Christian mythology here. So long before Narnia begins, you think, well, Narnia was his great mythology, and yes, it was, but it was his mythology for children. Think of this as his mythology for adults. Yeah, John?
Before you, and maybe you aren't leaving it totally, but scientism, there's a corollary to scientism, and that is the analytical way of thinking, which he attacks in a number of ways, that the modern mind is so analytical, that the bird on the wing is different from very different than the bird on the dissecting table.
Yeah.
The way modern mind works in contrast to the medieval mind, and which is actually what he's doing in the first Ransom books, is he's trying to show what it's like.
I'm gonna hand this back here to you so people can hear you.
He's trying to get to this this mindset that, of course, you have to have an analysis, you have to have abstraction, but the modern mind is so abstract. And I think he did it, or maybe it was one of Clyde Kilby or someone. He used the illustration that you cannot enjoy the embrace and the kiss of a lover at the same time you're trying to analyze what it's like, what's happening with your in the type of thing. And so in the trilogy, when he's seeing the planets and he's trying to show just what pure joy and delight of just experiencing, rather than just thinking about it too much.
Which is what Perelandra, that's why Perelandra is so picturesque, and he talks about it's like meeting pleasure for the first time. But then that becomes the problem in Perelandra. When the unman comes along and tempts Eve, so far, the Eve character in Perelandra has been enjoying food, but then she begins to experience, okay, I'm enjoying this food, but then my immediate thought is the food I don't have, what's out there that I could have. And so dissatisfaction starts to set in. And yet Lewis is the one who is making such a big deal of pleasure and the enjoyment of the goodness of creation and so forth. And scientism, you fall into this overly analytical space wherein, how do I say it? He would rather children delight in a frog, and so you have Puddleglum, the marsh wiggle, in the silver chair. He'd rather delight in a frog than dissect a frog. And so, in That Hideous Strength, Dorothy Sayers, to your point, John, Dorothy Sayers read a series of reviews, negative reviews of That Hideous Strength. And she wrote a letter. So Perelandra received great reviews because it was so staggeringly ornate from a literary perspective and all the beauty that you heard Cy talk about here a second ago. And yet That Hideous Strength got some negative reviews. Now, I think there are a couple of reasons for it. One, it hit close to the nerve. It was so pertinent, and it challenged, even in the middle of last century, the sort of rise of a socialistic mentality that was embryonic in England at the time. And secondly, as Dorothy Sayers says, her opinion of why That Hideous Strength was negatively reviewed is because in Perelandra, you've got dragons and all these strange creatures. You have strange creatures on the planet here on Mars and out of the silent planet, and yet this takes place in Belbury, in England. This takes place in England on Earth, and yet you have these spiritual and fantastical elements. And while you might accept spiritual and fantastical elements on another planet, it's fantasy, it's sci-fi, Dorothy Sayers said, people are not willing to have a book written on our planet about real life in England, and there be spiritual things as well. And Dorothy Sayers says, the reason I like it is because that's the only way I know how to live life. I live life in the real world around me, and yet I experience the spiritual at the same time. And what she's saying is materialism, atheistic materialism, has taken over. And whereas an atheist might be able to read a sci-fi novel about another planet and read about angels and creatures and an Eve character or whatever, it's gone out, Apple TV. Anyway, they're not willing to read about that in the real world. And she's pinpointing the problem that an overly analytical materialism is why That Hideous Strength was rejected by some reviewers, an overly analytical, materialistic worldview. Well, if you want to read a little more, I think, academically on Lewis and the planetary scheme, the discarded image, he talks about it there. This planetary theme is in Ransom, it's in Narnia. We've made much of that. But what you have in Perelandra is Dr. Lewis Ransom flies into space. Well, how does he wind up there? Well, he's a philologist. He's out for a walk He's at Cambridge University. He goes on a walk, and he's kidnapped by two men, Dick Devine, and Dr. Weston, a mad scientist who wants to push the boundaries of man's evolution and the progress of humanity from Earth to other planets. In other words, for humanity to move forward, humanity is going to have to colonize other planets. And it doesn't matter who and what the inhabitants of the other planets are, we'll annihilate them and we'll colonize those other planets because that's necessary for man to evolve and continue. Because the only thing that matters to Weston is man, the evolving creature. It's not about a particular man or a particular someone that he loves. It's this idea that man is the center of reality and man must proceed at all cost and will colonize the planets. And so they take Ransom with them. They kidnap Ransom, who is, again, the Tolkien figure. They kidnap Ransom, and they're taking him, and he wonders why. And I love somebody. I wish Debbie were here, could get me back on track. Luke, do you think you could come get me turned on and get my Apple going again, baby? Well, you know, who among us is a Debbie Pixley, right? Few of us are. But they kidnap Ransom, they wrestle him down, they drug him, they put him on a spaceship, and off they go to blasting out into outer space. And he doesn't really know why this is happening until he overhears a conversation between Devine and Ransom. They are taking him with them to offer as a sacrifice to the creatures who inhabit Melicandra, known as the Sorns. The Sorns. And he's going to be a sacrifice when they arrive at Melicandra. Now, there is all of this incredible picturesque language. It doesn't rise to the level that you see in Perelandra, but nonetheless, it's there. And they get there, and he notices all of these creatures who live on the planet. And what he finds is these creatures, the Sorns, the Hurras, these inhabitants of Melicandra are actually creatures he can befriend. And rather than becoming a sacrifice to him, he realizes they're intelligent, they are people, they have community, they have family, they have a society, and it becomes clear to him that they would not want a sacrifice of him. That's the evil thinking of wicked people like Devine and Weston, thinking they're going to have to take a sacrifice with them. And so he befriends these characters. Again, I don't want to let too many spoilers out, but it becomes pretty clear with Weston, who is himself, with Ransom, who is a philologist. He quickly learns the language of the people. He's actually able to interact with them and talk. And then in the end, Weston shows back up, kills one of these creatures, one of these Hross that Ransom befriended. His name was Haoi. And he gets killed. And of course, Ransom is devastated over this, but he realizes at this point what Weston is about. Weston is here to utterly colonize the planet with humans, wipe out the inhabitants. And what he has discovered is that the difference between Melicandra and the silent planet is that the bent one, like you bend a wire, the bent one has infiltrated the silent planet. The silent planet, of course, is Thulkandra. Anybody want to guess what the silent planet is that has been taken over by Dark Force? Thank you, my friend. Thank you. Anybody want to guess what the silent planet or Thulkandra is? Earth, exactly. We are the silent planet. We are the planet where the bent one has been, where evil has been. And that's why Ransom realizes, oh, Weston has come from the silent planet with me, and he's trying to bring the influence of the bent one here, and it's going to result in the devastation and annihilation of all these creatures and the tainting of this planet. Well, what ends up happening here is that, and again, I hate to let all of the, cat out of the bag, but what ends up happening is we're introduced to a character, the Molly Dill, and Out of the Silent Planet, And the name Maladil is one who, quote, dared terrible things, wrestling with the bent one in Thulkandra. So this character, Maleldil is, I guess, probably the way you'd say it, Maleldil, he ventured terrible things wrestling with the bent one back on Thulkandra, or Earth. Of course, who is Maleldil? The incarnate Christ. The incarnate Christ came and ventured to wrestle with the bent one to save Thulkandra. And Lewis was asked, well, where do you get this name, Malildil? And he replied in 1945, Mal is equivalent to the definite article in some languages, and Eldil means a lord or ruler. Maleldil, literally, he says, means the ruler or the true God, the Dominus. In this story, there's a character who is the old one. The old one. That is God the Father. The bent one, of course, is Satan. And you'll also find the Eldilah throughout this story, and those are the angels of the planet. And so you already have Lewis, as he says, I'm trying to smuggle in theology. So the old one is the Father. The Maleldil is the incarnate one in this planet who comes and ends up he's already wrestled with the bent one on Thulkandra. Now Ransom has been sent to prevent this same tragic thing happening in Mars. Well, they come back to Earth, and that's the end of the story. The next story picks up, the one that many of you have such an affection for because of its beauty and how exquisite it is. The difference here is that you have this sort of Garden of Eden kind of thing going on. In other words, Venus is unspoiled by the fall. And in Paralandra, we meet the Eve character. And of course, Paralandra, much like Narnia, Lewis says, Narnia, how did it begin? Remember last week we said it all began with a picture. He had a picture of a fawn carrying some Christmas presents, walking in the snow. That was the picture he had in his mind, and he wrote Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the rest is history. Well, for Paralandra, he said it all began with a picture, and the picture I had in my mind was the picture of floating islands, a planet that consisted of floating islands. And so when you read Paralandra, they're kind of going around from one island to the other, and there's all of this description of how beautiful the water is and all of the colors they're surrounded by. Sai touched on some of that. There's the fixed land. There's the fixed land where the queen and king, the queen, who is the Eve figure, and the king, who we don't meet until the end of the book, who is the Adam character, they are allowed to travel all over the planet. There's only one thing they are forbidden to do, and that is to stay the night on the fixed land. Okay, does this sound familiar? Our first parents were, you can eat anything in the garden. There's only one thing you're not allowed to eat, and that's the forbidden fruit. And so Eve and Adam, the king and queen, they were allowed to, they could be on the floating islands and travel around in them. They could get off the floating islands and walk around in the fixed land. They just were not allowed to spend the night on the fixed land. And Ransom, of course, arrives here. He meets the queen. He meets this Eve character, and she's utterly innocent, almost childlike. There's no guile in her. There's no suspicion. There's nothing but pure childlike innocence about her until someone shows up, because this coffin-like spaceship that he takes up to Venus, there was someone else on that, and that was the character that we met in the last book, who was Weston. Only when Weston gets here, he calls upon the bent one to invade him, and he becomes taken over by the devil, and then he takes on the character of the serpent in the garden, and he starts trying to tempt Eve, this Eve character. And the way that he does it is by gaslighting her. It is just classic gaslighting, if ever I've seen it. In fact, he says, she says to him, well, we can walk on the fixed land, but we are not allowed to spend the night on the fixed land. And by this point, Weston has become the unman. He's lost all of his humanity. And in fact, there's one point at which Ransom reminds him of what Malildel has done to overcome the Bent One on Thulkandra or on Earth. And it says the unman howled like a dog. The thought of the incarnate Christ was so upsetting and painful to him that he howled like a dog, kind of like a vampire would recoil from a crucifix or something like that. And so the unman starts tempting this woman. And what Lewis says is he never goes to sleep. The unman never sleeps. He never ceases trying to tempt Eve to fall. Ransom has to sleep. But the unman who's been taken over by the devil has no need of physical rest. And so he's just constantly tempting and trying to break her down. And she says, we are not allowed to walk on the fixed land. And the unman says, but he has never forbidden you to think about it, has he? And so what does she do? Well, we can't walk on it, but I guess we could think about walking on it. All right? It's really, really ingenious what's going on here. And then he says, actually, Malildel would be pleased with you if you would disobey him, because what he really wants is for you to essentially recognize your own independence from him. But he can't ask you to do it. He can't tell you to become independent of him, but that's what would really make him proud. That's what would really make him proud. I mean, maybe the closest corollary to this, maybe I could think of would be maybe a parent has a child who is still living with them, well into their 30s, and they don't want to tell them, hey, why don't you go out and strike out and become independent and make it on your own? They would really rather their child aspire to that themselves. Well, in some ways, that's what's going on here. He's saying to Eve, he's not going to tell you to disobey him, but that's what he really wants, because he wants you to be independent. He wants you to realize your potential. He wants you to realize that you can make it on your own, and that would actually please him. And so if you really want to obey him and really please him, what would really obey and please him is if you disobeyed this command not to stay the night on the fixed land. And so he just twists everything. It's just complete postmodern gaslighting. And no matter what she says back to the unman, what she says about being faithful to Malildel, to the Christ figure, he has an answer for it. And he says, well, actually, to obey him would actually disappoint him. So really obeying him is disobeying him. And so this continues until Ransom realizes this is not going to stop. And Ransom confronts him and says, tell her what became of you on Thulkandra. Tell her what became of the Bent One when Malildel became a man, when the Son of God became a man. And the remembrance of the incarnation caused the unman to cry out and howl like a dog. And he backs off from trying to tempt her for a while, but then he won't stop. He just keeps at it and keeps at it until finally Ransom realizes he's going to have to destroy Weston's body, because Weston is no longer Weston. Weston is gone. The man is gone. This is simply the devil. And so they get into this fight. And if you've read Perelandra, I mean, it is a barn burner. I mean, it is a brawl. The way he describes this fight that takes place between Ransom and this devil-possessed Weston, this unman. What happens in this fight, I'm letting the spoilers out, but I'm going to leave it there. But I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end of Perelandra, because you simply need to read it. Okay, you need to read it. I'm going to leave off with the fight that takes place, but I'm going to say this. Guess what happens to Ransom when he fights with the unman? And I mean, it is tooth and nail. It is as beautifully picturesque as Lewis can be with the colors and the environment. It makes you want to say, look, this is like, I mean, I can't even imagine. Where did this come from with this dowdy old Englishman? How could he think of this kind of beauty? Similarly, that brawl, that fight that takes place between Weston and Ransom is equally picturesque. Guess what happens to Ransom in that fight? Yes, he defeats. He manages to protect Eve and Adam from the unman's continuing to tempt them, but he receives an injury. Anybody want to guess where? Maggie, do you remember where the injury was for Ransom?
It's in his heel.
It's in his heel.
We haven't even gotten that far yet, so I don't know where you found that out. That's fascinating.
When you pick up in this book here, and John said that this book is so pertinent, and it's so pertinent because now Lewis is he's not traveling through space. Ransom's not traveling through space. He's not on another planet. He's right in England, and a corporation has formed, kind of this secret society has formed, and they're going to take over everything. They are called the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, or NICE. The National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. And they are doing all kinds of experiments on animals, on people. That idea of a severed head being kept alive, and they're trying to create a new, evolved humanity, and anyone who's not going to get with their program will be done away with. But when you get to that hideous strength, on the other side of the equation from NICE is this foundation of a group of Christians who have, and one of them is not a Christian yet, but they're a group of people who believe in the God that Ransom believes in. And Ransom, you don't realize this at first, but Ransom is the leader of this organization. And the thing that Lewis says about this leader of the new organization that's going to fight NICE is that he has a wound in his foot. And I remember, when I first read it, and they're talking about our leader has a wound in his foot that we need to constantly attend to, but he has a wound in his foot that won't go away. And I'm like, I see what you're doing there. And so, again, there's more I could say, but I just don't want to let all the spoilers out. You need to read these things for yourself. John, why did you say you think Hideous Strength is so pertinent? I'm going to bring the microphone back to you. Hold it close.
Well, if it's not an overt conspiracy, there is a conspiracy going on to basically do away with our beliefs, our mode of life. They are rigorous in the enemies of what they're doing. I think you did it real well. That it might be modernity now, but there's their truth, and if you don't accept their truth, then it's all over for you. They have, matter of fact, it's probably even that coming from some New Age philosophy that even people who are thinking in a particular way can inhibit the evolution of the race. So they have to do away with us totally.
Yeah.
The science, the pure science of it all, just inexorable science, which just takes over everything. So,
Yeah.
We're in a major spiritual battle, and and Lewis brings it down to the earth level, but it's still a spiritual battle.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a spiritual battle now on Earth. It was on Mars, it was on Venus, now it's happening on Earth. And for NICE, which is kind of interesting, that the organization is called NICE, but they're anything but nice. And he talks about vivisection in this book. The idea of just, cutting animals up, doing experiments on them, cutting people up, doing experiments on them, and so forth. This is the most disturbing of the three books because it feels so real, and it's something that's happening on earth, and you see how expendable people are. And so Lewis is constantly trying to protect the idea of the dignity of the human, the image of God in man. But he never does that apart from the incarnation. The thing that is consistent across all three books is the incarnate Christ. Whether it's Melildel in the first two as a picture of Christ, or Ransom himself, who is kind of a Christ figure with his wounded heel in Hideous Strength. Yeah.
Here's one other thing: is the pressure to conform.
Yes.
Is just so strong. Which if you aren't feeling it, it's all on us as well.
So the opening character is a man named Mark Studdock, and he's been married to his wife Jane for 6 months. He's a very talented kind of journalist and writer, and the organization NICE, they need his talents to create propaganda and spin. And they want him to write, here's the interesting thing, they want him to write articles for more conservative news sources and for more left-leaning news sources, and make sure that they're constantly against each other, and to control the way that people are thinking so that they can continue to doing what they do. And so basically he starts writing articles about things before they even happen, so that when they happen, the article is already there because NICE is controlling everything. So it's not like, a murder happens and then he reports on it. Now, he's already written the articles and the various perspective on that event. They're ready to go in the news sources before it actually ever even happens, because NICE is controlling everything, of course. The only way, though, for NICE to be overcome, because it's completely taking over humanity, it's buying land, it's just completely, and there's a very specific reason why they want the land they want, because of what's buried there, and it'll blow your mind. But ultimately, the only hope is for Ransom and this little Christian group around him, really to hold forth what amounts to the victory of the gospel. In other words, for Lewis, the only solution to this governmental group called NICE is not another form of government, not another political party or some such thing. It actually has to be this man with the wounded heel, this man with the wounded foot. So again, I wish I could say more, but I don't want to just spoil everything, because then you'd say, why bother reading it? So I would encourage you. Yeah.
On the left, is that the unmanned?
Yes. Yeah. So the unmanned, and then these are all these other characters that are around.
And then Melildel above.
Yeah.
And then who was the Venus god figure? So there was the old god, I forget,
the old one.
But then there's two gods.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. Okay, so
and I believe he thought there was some feminine.
Yes, one is masculine and one is feminine. So the last couple of chapters, and we're talking about Perelandra here. The last couple of chapters of Perelandra, there's this valley between a couple of mountains of the fixed land, and Ransom is greeted by the Oyarsa of Malacandra and the Oyarsa of Perelandra. So you have these godlike angels, one from Mars and one from Venus, and because they are so appreciative of how he has fought off the unman, they themselves appear to him in a way that he can see them. They're not just immaterial spiritual beings. They appear to him in a way that he can see them, and he can tell that they represent Mars and Venus. And so Mars is metallic, strong, hard, and this solidity, a show of strength. And then the Oyarsa of Venus is warm and glowing. And so the one is masculine and the one is feminine. But the reason that the Venus figure and the Mars figure show up here is because Lewis is saying that these planets have been spared. These planets have been spared the victory of the bent one. And so that's what's going there. But yeah, the Venus character, and because Venus is considered feminine to begin with, and that's why he presents.
Is it, if we're thinking Trinity, then that would be the Holy Spirit, right?
I don't think there's anything that he says that this is the Holy Spirit, because he's not presenting he's not presenting the Oyarsa as the God figures. He is presenting them as sort of guardian angels of each planet. They are like the divine guardians of each planet, but they're not one of the members of the Trinity. The old one is the Father. Melildel is the Son. When you well, I'm thinking about Gandalf here. When Gandalf says, when somebody says, what is Gandalf? And he says, I am the servant of the fire. That was Tolkien's way of saying he is a servant of the Holy Spirit. But no, these are not pictured as the Father and the Spirit, but they are the ultimate, kind of the archangels of Mars and Venus, or the deities of Mars, and the divine guardians of Mars and Venus, one masculine, one feminine.
He talks about the heavenly host when the Osiris from Malacandra sends him back. He says that there'll be others around you guarding you.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of this idea of the heavenly host.
The angelic beings and archangels and angels. The Elildel are angels, but these Oyarsa are higher ranking, like archangels. Now, he's not trying to find a one-to-one biblical correspondence with biblical characters necessarily. It's not like one of them is Michael and one of them is Gabriel. He's saying there are many of these angels, these archangels, and the Elildel who are all around. And so, bottom line, Lewis had an exceedingly supernatural worldview, which is what I think makes him to this day so relevant. Even if you're not someone who is interested in fantasy and these kind of things, what makes him so relevant and I think so effective against the spread of materialism in his day was how utterly supernatural a worldview that he had. Now, because of that, he did not reject science by any means, but he was a thoroughgoing supernaturalist. And I think that's maybe something that we struggle with ourselves. I would say, and I need to let you go here because it's time, but I would say you are going to probably struggle with the first couple of chapters just getting the rhythm here as he's describing the ship they're in. A lot of effort goes into describing the spaceship they're in. But if you can hang with this book, then Perelandra will slow you down a little bit, not because it's unduly complex, but because it is so picturesque that you just can't read it quickly. The imagery is so vivid that it is going to, it's going to tax your processor. Your RAM is going to be taxed trying to take in all of the colors and all the imagery. And then I think that hideous strength is going to be it's going to be a little more accessible because it's happening here on Earth. It's happening in England, and it's real people, and it's not a whole bunch of strange creatures that you're having to imagine what they must look like. And yet there's a lot of history, as Pam was saying here. There's a lot of medieval history. There's a lot of, if it's been a while since you've thought about things like King Arthur and Merlin and medieval tales, that's going to come up here. And so in some ways, this may be the most complex of the three. But I commend them to you. They're my favorite of all of Lewis's writings, outside of A Grief Observed, and I don't know which one. I think this one's my favorite just because it enthralled me the first time. But certainly these two are more important in terms of what they're communicating, and there's just more complexity and depth. So this one is, more introductory, but it culminates in this. So anyway, thanks for hanging. Next week, we are going to begin 2 weeks is it the week after next? Next week. And then there's a week that we skip because of spring break. So there's 2 more weeks. And then there's a week that we skip, and then we come back for a final week. Is that what it is? Okay.
The 12th is when you're not doing it.
Because I will be chaperoning the seniors from CPA down to the trip to Orlando, so I won't be here. But what we're going to do next, we're going to do 2 weeks in Mere Christianity. The first week, we're going to talk about the biography of Mere Christianity. We'll get into the argument a little bit, but this is a book that has a biography. There's a story to Mere Christianity that's going to take us back to where we were last semester, and we're going to be with Lewis during the Second World War. In other words, this book that has resulted in so many people coming to faith in Christ, Mere Christianity, was a wartime. It was a wartime product. It was a product of the war. And so we'll tell the story of Mere Christianity. We'll get into the argument, spend a couple of weeks in that, and then we will end this semester by visiting an uncle and his nephew. And you can figure out who they are. So thanks for coming tonight. Amy, welcome. Ryan, welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight. Anybody else new here? I don't see anyone else new. But go get you some. Well, no, there are no goodies. Y'all have taken all the English goodies and treats. They are gone. So, are there still a few more left? Okay. Good. Let me pray. Father, thank you for time to be together tonight. Lord, thank you for the vivid imagination steeped in the incarnation that was your servant, C.S. Lewis. Lord, I pray that you would call us to... That you would call us to ourselves be lost in wonder at the reality of the Trinity and the victory of the incarnate one, whether it is told to children in the person of Aslan or to adults on Mars and Venus as Melildel, or in your word as Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.